Ladies and gentlemen, and brothers and sisters, Dr. Charles G. Hurst, Jr. is president of Malcolm X College. Malcolm X College is located in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Hurst is an educator, a communication scientist, an audiologist who specializes in language developments and oral and communication problems of lower socio-economic and Black Americans. Dr. Hurst is a dynamic individual who was a high school dropout at 15. He decided to continue his education. Then at the age of 23, he received his high school diploma, where he then proceeded to obtain a bachelor's degree in business administration. He obtained this degree in 2.5 years, and an MA degree in 1959, and a PhD degree in 1961, both from the Wayne State University. He also has done postdoctorate work at the University of Florida and Ohio State University. Dr. Hurst, who is a member of the New Black Intelligentsia, dedicated to relating education to Black Americans, making education serviceable to Black people, and working closely with Black people to gain political and economical liberation. Without further hesitation, I would like to introduce to you the vibrating Dr. Charles G. Hurst, Jr. Dr. Hurst.
Thank you. Gee, I thank you very much. It almost scares me out of saying what I had in mind to say. I listen to introductions like this, you know, and I get to thinking that all the trouble they got to go through to try to make me respectable. I didn't really know what to do. I'm here in Ames, Iowa for the first time, and I didn't really know how to act. I didn't really even know how to dress. I asked him, should I put my other clothes on? You know, I got some white folks' clothes I bring with me just in case the folks, you know. Because I know how they are. He doesn't look like a college president. So I got a double-breasted suit and a tie and some interesting shoes. But then the brothers gave me courage, even though they themselves were in costume. They said, you can... So I felt rather good. They made me really feel at ease. I'm very glad to be here because there's something very symbolic about what's going on this evening. They told me when I came that there are 20,000 people at this university. I think the other 19,950 got the wrong night. They figured that Black night is going to be tomorrow night when the keynote speaker is going to be here. And we're going to be in a hell of a shape because this place is going to be jammed with 19,950 folks who thought that tonight was tomorrow. But that's all right. We'll get one of the brothers from the football team to run for a touchdown or something. And do something to entertain them. But for tonight, we're going to mess up those few who came, because I'm going to talk for a long time. If you get to feeling like you're bored or anything, you just feel free to just walk on out, wave your hand as you go, something like that. But I'm really very glad to be here because many times people in the heartland of America really don't find out what's going on in America. The New York Times takes too long getting here, and the local newspaper just can't afford to print enough pages to really tell you all of the news. Therefore, you really don't know what's going on. And it makes me feel rather good to be able to come here and just tell you what's going on in the outside world. And there's some terrible things going on in the outside world, I can tell you. Got people going to moon, Did you know some people went to the moon not too long ago? Fellows went to the moon and they got up there and they, I don't know, I guess television does program that into Ames. They got to the moon and these cats were walking, you know, silently on the moon. And I'm watching this on television. I really didn't believe they were on the moon, you know, except that I saw it on television. If it's on television, it must be true. So I was watching it, and all of a sudden, a little circle appeared on the television set, and there was the president, Richard Milhous Nixon. And he got a telephone in his hand. I said to myself, what is this fool doing? Got a telephone. He said, I'm calling the moon. And I thought that was a rather nice thing for him to do. And so he asked those fellows up there, well, what is it like up there? And they said, it's beautiful. And he said, what do you see? And they said, nothing. And I thought to myself that it's a very strange world that we've come to in these days, because it's a true fact. Maybe this is what we're working for on Earth, is a kind of world where there is nothing. After we've successfully killed all the people in the world, maybe we'll be like the moon, and maybe then Mr. Nixon will call the Earth, and we will be able to comment about how beautiful it is, because there will be no people there. Between the Vietnams and the other forms of genocide that we're able to develop, we will have eliminated all of the people. And I think that all of this is happening or possible because somewhere along the way America got lost, and the people of America sort of lost their way. And I think that it was no more perfectly demonstrated than by the Lieutenant Calley case. Lieutenant Calley, as you know, is a murderer. He's a man who kills babies and throws them in ditches and shoots them in the head, killed women, old men, so on, all who had nothing to fight back with except their knuckles. And he was found guilty of being a murderer by his peers, people who also are skilled in killing other people. And after he was found guilty of this murder, these murderers, he was then given a reprieve by the President of the United States, and he was sent to his motel in order that he could rest in peace while he was waiting his appeal, which could take 4 or 5 years. Now, I didn't much worry about that, or else I would not have, if it had not been for the paradox existing in the United States today in the person of another young individual convicted of nothing, having murdered nobody, but who is in jail today, not in a motel, in jail, awaiting trial, awaiting the determination as to whether or not she, Angela Davis, is guilty or not. It's an interesting paradox. This young, clean-cut white boy, on the one hand, who has been found guilty of murdering people, is sitting in a motel watching television while he is awaiting his appeal. And this young, clean-cut black woman, on the other hand, is sitting in a jail cell, awaiting the decision of some people as to whether or not the law under which she is being tried is even constitutional. Something wrong with this. And I want to remind you that I'm not commenting upon the rightness or wrongness of the decision in the Calley case. I have no doubt in my mind that there are other people who are equally guilty and they ought to be in jail. We probably ought to go down to the ranch and get that cat and bring him up and check him out and see what we ought to do with him. But that's not the point. They got Calley, they found him guilty, and so on. It's going to be kind of up to you as to who else is going to be found guilty. But you see, the problem is really not manifest in this paradox alone. I was reading an article the other day in one of the more popular magazines, Punishment Without Trial, a report by the Justice Department that states that there are 160,000 prisoners in city and county jails, counted by census takers on a single day, who have not been convicted. And I need not tell you that most of these are black people. Black people who are in jail, not having been convicted, but sentenced to periods of from 1 hour on up to 1 year by the same person who arrested them without having had the benefit of the kind of trial that we say we pride ourselves in America. For those of you who don't know, you got 369 such persons right here in the state of Iowa. But you can feel rather proud because in the state of Illinois we have almost 4,000. And in the state of California, which is the leader, we have 12,730 people who are awaiting trial in lengths that vary from 1 day to a year and a year and a half. And then people wonder why, after a man has been found innocent, after a year or a year and a half in jail, that he's ungrateful. There's something wrong in our society, and it's something that it seems to me that only the honorable people in the society are going to be able to do something about. But I sometimes wonder if there are truly any honorable people left in the society. Our collegiate institutions seem to be more preoccupied with their plush stadiums and football teams and other kinds of signs of athletic prowess. They seem to be more concerned with turning out people who are proficient at killing people than they are with turning out the kinds of humanists that we need. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about the relevance and the irrelevance of education, the role that education plays in all that we're going through, and the responsibility that education has for helping to open the doors of opportunity and equality for all minority group people, irrespective of what color they may be. Some of the things I may say you might not agree with. Frankly, I don't care. The important thing is that you know that there is a black man who is a scholar and who is all of those other things that you said that if we became, you would let us in, and you ain't done it yet, who feels this way about conditions in America. Because you might consider this to be a form of the last appeal. And again, I say that we're living in a hell of a country today because our values are all upside down. It's not only in the case of the moon where we burn enough fuel on the way there to feed the poverty-stricken of any major city for at least a month, if not 6 months. And it's not only the kind of waste that we leave up there on the moon, having taken color television sets and so on. Something a little bit more than that. And Albert Szent-Györgyi, the Hungarian-born biologist, said it most nicely for me, that man is a very strange animal. In much of the world, half of the children go to bed hungry, and we continue to spend $1 trillion on rubbish, steel, iron, tanks, and guns. We're all criminals, and yet we refuse to admit it. And yet, if we live among criminals and we remain silent, then we are as much criminals as they. Szent-Györgyi points out that at the present we are definitely on the road to self-extermination because American society has apparently become extermination-oriented. And then at the same time, we have in our society such things as a vice president of the United States who walks around calling people names. And that's a hell of a thing. I've always known that traditionally the vice president of the United States did not have much to do. But this is a new role. Every time Agnew opens his mouth with some new name, I run to my dictionary. PhD and all, I still got to go to my dictionary, and he barely made it through a bachelor's degree. He called such people such names as effete snobs. And I remember when I first heard that, I asked myself, what the hell is an effete snob? And charlatans of peace. We have not heard that kind of language since the days of King Arthur. And criminal misfits. I'm wondering what is the difference between a criminal misfit and a non-criminal misfit. Tragic thing to me that we have a president, a vice president of the United States walking around disseminating this kind of inflammatory nonsense, much of it designed, intentionally or otherwise, to turn people against people, as if we didn't have enough of that in this country. I think that all of this ought to disturb the enlightened people of this country, irrespective of color or race or creed. The indignation ought to be particularly acute in our universities, such as this one, because the universities have for years been the centers of our humanistic influence. Seems to me that all of us ought to be very deeply grieved over conditions that we ought to be able to do something about. And yet we find a strange kind of insistence in some of the greatest of our institutions on withdrawing into those hallowed halls of ivy without expressing shock, protest, and determination to become involved. I can't understand why on every Thursday when the kill count comes from Vietnam, people can go about their normal business. Seems to me that on that day there ought to be a moratorium on everything else in the United States, and everyone ought to stop for a moment of silence. It seems to me that people ought to have difficulty in holding back a tear. But we've been programmed not to cry about anything, not to care about anything unless they put it in the headlines of a newspaper. We've been programmed when to cry and when not to cry. And it's very strange to me that it would happen in university settings, because throughout the ages, men of wisdom and vision and young people of compassion have turned to education as the principal means of coping with the ills of mankind. And education has usually responded, although sometimes lethargically and only after incessant prodding. But the very massiveness of the task as we view it today has caused even the great institution of American education to become thwarted and crawl back into its hole. And I think that's why we have so many disillusioned young people in this country today. Perhaps the greatest cause of disillusionment among the young people of our colleges, especially the black young people of our colleges, has been the inability or the unwillingness of higher education to adjust without bitter struggle to a new kind of social scene, one in which the university is being called upon to act as a direct agent of change rather than simply as a recorder and an analyst of historical events. Actually, I do believe that the 20th century role of education in dealing with the bases for human conflict ought to be quite clear to every single one of us. The pursuit of academic excellence, which is a legitimate pursuit in the university, is fully compatible with service to the community. The educational institution is or should be an integral part of the total national community and must exist primarily to serve and to support it. And I say the total national community with great deliberateness, because I'm saying that you cannot isolate yourself in a situation such as this in Ames, Iowa, from the tragedies of the urban centers of our country. That you are equally responsible with those of us who are centered in these locations for seeking out problems and seeking out the answers to these problems and trying to develop the people who are capable of coping with these problems. I'm saying that the university, wherever it might exist, is supposed to seek out the diverse problems, economic, social, cultural, scientific, and political, and apply all of its resources to a search for solutions. In other words, I think that what I'm saying to you is that probably the most important single explanation of why this country is in such trouble today is the absence in the contemporary sense of a clearly defined, explicit, and accepted social mission for its universities and colleges. I'm fully convinced that if the important objectives of human effort are ever to be
realized that we're going to have to do something about the ill-defined hierarchy of human values as taught or not taught at all in our schools. I think it's no wonder that this country and almost every campus in it has been set by irreconcilable conflicts in the light of the deterioration of the morality structure that every people must have. I think it's not a surprise then that the United States is undergoing a debilitating moral crisis as a direct result of the failure of the institutions of higher education to face up to issues. For example, the major crises of our day are based in the racism that has become an inherent part of our system of life. But the failure of our schools to develop a contemporary ethic upon which an honest morality can be built to combat racism has left this country and its leaders in a state that finds benign paternalism, materialism, and repression superseding all else, while concern is almost non-existent for such values as human life, human dignity, and the unimpeded opportunity to pursue happiness. And we often ask people what the relevant curriculum ought to contain. Seems to me that the answer is very obvious. Anytime we have people who can go all the way through to a PhD without ever understanding what white racism is all about, then we're in trouble because we have an irrelevant curriculum. Anytime we have people who can negotiate the entire scheme of education as I did, without knowing what institutional racism is all about, then we're in trouble because we have an irrelevant education that is not doing its job. Because racism became irrevocably intertwined in the metabolism of this society so long ago until most of us don't even know when it began. The fact that there was slavery in this country is only part of it. But the fact that most of us do not understand the relationship of the political system under which we live to the racism with which we live is another of the tragedies of our times. It may be important to state unequivocally at this point my recognition that one very important role of education is the training of people to fill the professional and technical manpower needs of their community and of our society at large. In other words, I'm saying to the black people of this country that we're going to have black people who are trained in the competencies. In other words, we need black engineers, and we need black physicians, and we need black lawyers, and we need black social workers, and we need black teachers, and we need black everything, because we are on the verge of the kind of black revolution that will see black people taking over their own communities and supporting themselves. We cannot afford to have a black community that must call in white competence in order to wake up in the morning or in order to turn on the street lights at night. So we understand what we're about in that area, but we are also saying that we want to be able to develop that kind of technical competence without developing the sense of inhumanity that has become one of the concomitants of American education and of the American educated person. You see, above all else, the education process must produce human beings. And if the education process is not capable of doing this, then we must do whatever is necessary to keep that process from dehumanizing us while we are seeking our way to the leadership that this country so drastically needs. I think that if the education process would produce human beings and help provide answers to such problems as poverty, race relations, peace, and personal identification, then it's going to have to change some of its postures. I think that the competence in doing this must grow out of the willingness on the part of education as an institution to humanize itself first, and then to function as an agent of dynamic and radical social change in order to create a better world. The call is imperative as I see it, because I do believe that we are running out of time. In the decades since Sputnik, we've seen an unprecedented escalation of worldwide tensions, uninhibited fratricide in Vietnam, Africa, Cambodia, and in the Middle East. A year of rebellion by the youth in our colleges, flaming kinds of explosions in the streets of our cities, murders of citizens by police and murders of police by citizens, and all of the ingredients for a final resolution of national problems through police state tactics which would eventually enslave us all. This is what we have become, and the frightening future we face is alarmingly clear unless we develop some new directions whose foundations must originate in our universities and our colleges. But I do believe that the present situation was brought on because education was caught bringing up the rear on countless moral and humanistic as well as educational issues. It's rather shameful to me that the leadership in protesting against the genocide of Vietnam had to come from the students rather than from the administration. But maybe that's why we find chicken feathers around administrative offices every now and then. I think that at this moment the situation has become intolerable. If we are really to aspire to any kind of peace and pluralism in our society, the responsibility of the education enterprise to reassert its responsibility for moral leadership in all human affairs must become abundantly clear. And I think this is what black students have been trying to do in the various institutions of which they have been a part over the past few years. They have come to the conclusion that education must reaffirm its accountability to the people for its behavior as an institution which plays such an important role in shaping lives, attitudes, personal characteristics, and the national perspective. Most importantly, in order to be the moral force so urgently needed today, education must execute a critical reappraisal of current curricula and instructional practices, inspiring new solutions or new approaches to desired solutions, educating for change that will improve life conditions for unhappy millions, and demanding that all concerned people set aside tendencies toward parochialism and self-interest so that their talents can be used to promote the cause of humanity and justice in every possible way. In short, I'm saying that the education enterprise should exist as a revolutionary force, serving a countervailing function to the immense efforts to enslave mentalities and corrupt the psychological will of the masses. And at this point, I talk to my black brothers and sisters in this audience, because you've heard me use the term revolution and revolutionary on several occasions during these remarks. And I do believe that there must be a revolution in this country, and it must be a violent revolution. And these people listening to me, they probably, because this is a nation of violence, are able to define this in very narrow terms, because they think in order to have a violent revolution, there must be something such as the taking of life. There must be violence perpetrated by one person on another. And this is not necessarily what I am talking about. I'm talking about abrupt and suddenly initiated change. I am emphasizing the fact that black people for a long time had faith in the integrity of the institution of which they were a part, and they felt that if they asked for liberation and freedom, that eventually it would be given them, and it didn't come. And they felt that if they prayed for liberation and freedom, that eventually it would be given them, and it didn't come. And they felt that if they protested vigorously enough for liberation and freedom, that it would be given them, and it didn't come. Now, at this point, I think that what we are saying to black people is that if you want liberation and freedom, you're going to have to be willing to pay the price for it, and you're going to have to be willing to pay the price, whatever that price may be, and you are not the one that sets the price, just as the purchaser rarely ever has that privilege. You are going to have to be the one who is willing to pay whatever that price may be. And I'm suggesting to you that the revolution, if there ever is to be one, must begin within you as an individual. You have to be willing to recognize what Malcolm X talked about and what he meant when he talked about the various ways in which this society imposes a psychological weakness on black people that convinces them of their own inferiority. You're going to have to understand that the need is to first purge yourself. We cannot talk about purging this society of the evil consequences of racism if we are not able first to purge ourselves of the evil consequences of racism on ourselves. I'm saying the revolution begins inside of the individual. And I would say to the white people in this audience the very same kind of thing, because white people are traditionally bound to talk about they are perpetrating this against them. And isn't it too bad? Isn't it a pity that they? White people are too prone to talk about the failures of institutions. They talk about the failures of the church. The church is failing. They even talk about God failing. Those are some arrogant, egotistical people talking about God failing. How the hell can God fail? But that's what they have the arrogance and the nerve to do. And I'm saying that it's about time that they stop blaming institutions and begin to bring this thing down to the level of individuals. Because if this institution of which you are a part is racist, it's because you permit it to be that way. And as St. George say, if you, in the presence of criminals, do not react in a positive way against their criminal acts, then you yourself are a criminal. Rather silly to me that every time you try to talk to white people about racism, you know, and you tell them you're a racist, no matter how gently you tell them, they get all upset, get red. It seems to me that there's nothing wrong in recognizing that you are racist, because that's the first step in doing something about what I've said is the overriding problem in our society today.
When they come to the point where they're finally beginning to believe that they are racist, then they say, well, you won too.
But this is not the answer to tell me that I am one too. Obviously, I had to go through the same kind of pattern that you had to go through. If you live in a racist society, it's inevitable that you will become a racist yourself. I think the invidious thing about being a racist and being black at the same time is that you find that you yourself are the instrument of your own victimization. This is what Malcolm X was talking about. All y'all who haven't read Malcolm X, the autobiography, ought to do so. If you think it may not make you popular, do like I used to do when I was a kid. Read it up under the covers with a flashlight at night. Then leave the book where your wife or your husband can find it. It's a magnificent social document. Malcolm X was a great man, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit before I finish. But the meaningful thing about Malcolm X for black people was that he exemplified the way in which we have been taught to believe in our own inferiority. And we are constantly experiencing recreations of this. Those of you who have not read the article that appeared in the Harvard Educational Review a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, may not be aware that we still have people who are trying to recreate this myth. You black people who read the part about when Malcolm X was doing his hair, you know, he was conking his hair. And for you white people who don't have to conk your hair because it's straight already, I have to tell you that conking means taking a lye-based concoction and putting it into your scalp and combing it through your hair with great patience and persistence and evenness, in the knowledge that that lye will do everything. It will either get it straight like white or it'll burn your head off. And as I read that part of Malcolm's book, I began to identify with the man. You know, for the first time, I began to identify with him, because I could think of the time when I did that very same thing. You know, I was combing my hair. My friend boy, he was combing it for me, and I'm sitting there, and the head began to burn, putting that mess in my hair. And it got to the point where I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, and I told him, man, I can't stand this anymore. And he said, wait a minute, man, it's beginning to look good. And I told him, I told him, keep on, brother, keep on. And when we finally finished, and he said, all right, you can wash it out.
and I ran to the sink because my hair is on fire by now. You see, where we lived, everything was done in the kitchen sink, except that, we had that's all we had. So I ran to the kitchen sink, and we washed that lye out of my hair. And I looked up into the mirror and saw myself for the first time, and I flipped my head like this, and the hair fell in my face, and I said, "Oh, Lord, to glory." And I thought that my greatest day had come. But actually, as Malcolm said, it was my moment of greatest self-degradation, because I had succeeded in destroying a part of me that only God could make. God had made me in His image, and I had succeeded because of my overwhelming sense of inferiority in destroying a part of me. And those of you who don't understand the black dilemma and the black problem today ought to probe that one just a little bit. And those black people who still aren't certain that they are proud of being black ought to think on that one just a little bit. Frankly, I think that you're in bad shape if you are not proud to know that you're a member of what may not be a superior race, but certainly stands up there in the forefront. I think it's also important that at that same time in the history of black people in this country, there was such a thing as what we still call it Natanola. It's just its purpose has changed. And see, for white people who are not aware, Natanola is the concomitant of suntan lotion. Just like white people today are spending money trying to get black, in those days, black people were spending money trying to get light. And they would go to the store and spend a lot of money buying this Natanola. You see, today they still sell Natanola, but they say today it's simply to get you even, But in those days, we used to sneak that Natanola home in the evening, and we would put it on just before we went to bed. And then we'd get up in the morning and run for the mirror and look in there and say, "Thank the Lord, I'm a little bit lighter." Because we had been taught that if you were a little bit lighter, you were a little bit brighter, you were a little bit righter. Everything went on the basis of that. They had us feuding with ourselves on the basis of color. You see, always been able to find a way to turn niggers against themselves and against each other. And that's what you have to keep in mind. You see, when I was a youngster, the worst thing that anybody could call me was a nigger, almost. And then when they were angry with me, my other brothers and sisters, they say, "Nigger, nigger Charles, nigger, nigger Charles, nigger." And down there where they were really angry with me, they say, "Black nigger." That was the most terrible thing. They saved that for when they were really angry with me. Black nigger Charles, you black something. This is the kind of world that we came up in. It hasn't changed too much since that time. It's a kind of world that encompasses an educational system that has been committed to the idea of transforming black people into instruments of their own victimization. That's why I say that it is important to come to these universities and develop the technical competence that our communities must have. And I don't care where you go, I don't care what you're thinking about, whether you're thinking about being a man of peace or a man of war. I would hate like hell to be a member of an army of war where when you got to a bridge that had to be built, we had to debate and ask folks, "Do you know how to build a bridge?" "No, do you?" "Who knows how to build a bridge?" You'd be in bad shape, We must have the technical competence, but we also must guard against a kind of system that had us aspiring to be something that we could never become, and that's white people. And I have nothing against white people. Please believe that I'm not, really, I think they're very nice, just like all other people have the capability of being very nice. I'm simply pointing out some of the realities of the existence of black people in this country and some of the reasons for the psychopathology that one can observe in black communities all over this country.
The very fact that there is all kinds of psychological confusion grows out of this success criterion that says if you want to be an entire success, then you must come as close to white as is possible. I'm afraid that I didn't realize the fallacy of this until after I had finished all there was for the folks to give me in terms of their education enterprise. Because they said to me that if you become as white as you can, that we will let you in. We'll let you be just like us. So I worked my, whatever it is you want to call it, off. Since we're in very deep company, they tell me this is a men's union here, very private organization. You can't say things, freedom of speech, like you would in the regular university property. But when I had finished my education, I thought that I was very acceptable. I had learned how to walk like them, to talk like them, and to think like them. You know, I used to walk, I'd walk like this. You see it changed. And I went after my first job after I got that degree. And I went into the man, you know how you do, a slight, very sophisticated shuffle, head high, of course, but shuffling right on. And I said, I have completed all of my work at the university, and I would appreciate an opportunity to work with you in any capacity that you would so desire. Well, you know what the result was. Yes, sir. As a black man, I've been told I was underqualified, overqualified, unqualified, too qualified, dequalified. It's a hell of a thing being a black man in America, and the tragedy of it is that none of the black experience has been made part of the academic curricula. And so that unfortunately the same ignorance that I had, even after negotiating the entirety of this damned educational scheme, is shared by all of my white counterparts who go to college. After finishing college, they're just as ignorant as they were when they went in of the conditions that impinge on a large number of people in these United States. They are as ignorant of the richness of my culture and the rightness of my demands for justice. And they're as ignorant of their own guilt in terms of the continuation of racism in this country. You know, they talk to me these days and they say, well, are you talking about separatism? Why must you talk about separatism? We think this is bad. Well, I don't understand these people talking about separatism. Folks say they want a black house, you know. They say, why you won't be separate? Here we've been kept separate for 400 years, you know. The way the thing went all of those years, here were black people walking up and down the street. I got to somebody back there. Black people were walking up and down the street, banging on somebody's doors, demanding that they be permitted to live in some of those vacant premises, be permitted to buy where they could afford to buy. And white people kept laying down all kinds of conditions. That is, the middle-class, genteel white people. The less genteel threw rocks at them and shot at them and did everything else possible to them. And so white people, black people began to understand that they just don't want us. They don't want to integrate with us. And they also began to understand that integration, as it was being defined by white people, was a kind of assimilation that they could not endure. And so they began to talk to themselves about community building and about community control. They began to use such terms as nation time. They began to say to themselves that black is beautiful, and we know that it's beautiful. And the first time that we said black is beautiful, they began to call us racist. The first time that we said that we're going to take our own communities and make them beautiful, they began to call us separatists. And yet, have you ever experienced the phenomenon of hordes of white people bearing down on some kind of depressed black ghetto, demanding that they be given an opportunity to integrate that rat-infested, roach-ridden apartment that happened to be vacant there? I don't know what I would do if I saw hordes of white people descending on the black community of Chicago. I'd get scared and probably go get me some protection. And yet these are the same people who become upset simply because I say to them that I don't want to be your super nigger in your community anymore. I don't want to be the easer of your conscience because you are able to tell me and others that, well, we have one in our community and we are very proud of him. Oh, they say that. And then they go to work on you, you know. I used to live in one of those places. Go to work on you. They say, you know, you are different. And I had one tell me one night, you know, after all, you bathe regularly. Interesting thing. When black people didn't have bathtubs, they used to bathe in a creek. I've had the experience of bathing out of a glass. That's all we had was a glass of water. Wasn't nothing else to put it in. You know, you keep dipping in. Black people are very resourceful people, I think that I'm saying. And it's because of this resourcefulness that they've been able to survive all of these many years. And it's because of this resourcefulness that in the face of the intractability of the white community, they have finally begun to come to some very firm conclusions about their own existence in this country and the role that they must play. And I personally believe that the leadership that this country so urgently needs must come from the new awakening, from within the new awakening of black people. I think you've seen some of it on this campus. I think we've seen it all over the country. And I think that this is why it's so tragic that the people in education, the leaders of education, continue refusing to speak out as they ought to. We had what I call an inexplicable lethargy when 6 black citizens of Augusta, Georgia were shot in the back by police last year. In the same year, there were the Kent State and Jackson State slaughterings by National Guardsmen and police. And yet we continued to find this pitifully equivocal situation in higher education, and a similar pitifully equivocal response to pleas by black students for studies that are relevant. They constantly, instead of helping black students to define what relevancy means, they would ask them, what do you mean by relevance? What is Black Studies program? We ain't never heard of that. In a system where specialized studies of various kinds had become traditionally a part of that system, they would deny the possibility, the legitimacy of such as black studies. They had American studies, one university I went to. That's white racist studies. They had European studies. That was all right. They had Latin American studies, Near Eastern studies. One place I went to, they even had Yiddish studies. It was only when they put black in front of studies that all of a sudden people got all uptight and confused. Well, how can you put black in front of studies? Well, that's synonymous with nothing. What can you do with a black studies degree? That's a nothing studies degree. Everybody knows that black ain't nothing. Now, this was a damn shame. It was a damn shame that the leaders of American education were not more sensitive to the changing times. To me, the cynicism implied here is disgraceful, and it represents an abandonment of responsibility for professional and social leadership. I think that equally shameful is the failure of too many college administrators to respond appropriately to demands for revisions in admissions policies, to demands in the content of the first year. You see, all over the country now, they're talking about ways in which they are recruiting more black students. And see, you black students have to be very careful about trick bags. Because see, traditionally, the man has had trick bags. Every time you get the answer to one and you jump out of one, he got another one there for you. Zip. See? And the trick bag here is that American universities all over the country have been opening their doors to more and more minority group students and putting them into a revolving situation, guaranteeing that the doors that they come in are revolving doors. We hear a lot of bragging today about the increase in the number of black students in our colleges. We don't hear much talk about the increases in the numbers of black graduates from our colleges. And I can say quite urgently that the situation in the black community is about to become desperate. We have in this country right now something in the neighborhood of 350,000 physicians overall to serve the nation's population. In the black community, we have fewer than 6,000 physicians, and 50% of these are 50 years or older. Now, what does that say about the future of health care in the black community? And you know what the situation is in the medical schools. We've got to do something to combat our present condition. And we cannot rely on anyone except ourselves. That's the lesson of Nation Time. That's the lesson of Black is Beautiful. And that's the lesson of black power that we are talking about. You see, we are living in a period of oppression, whether you would believe that or not. We are living in a period of oppression, and we are the only ones who can do something about it. We are living in a period of genocide, and we are the only ones who can do something about it. But we have to be willing to recognize what those facts are, what the facts of life are that we are living under. We're going to have to recognize what I mean and what anybody else means when they say genocide. You're not going to learn these things in the classes because they generally will not teach them. And I want you to know the term genocide. What does it mean? And I'm not going to define it in my own terms. I'm going to define it as the United Nations has defined it, in order that you can understand the recalcitrance of this country in responding to the urgent pleas of its minorities and its depressed peoples. The term genocide is defined by Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on Genocide, drafted in December 11, 1946, reads as follows. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And then they go on to say, number one, killing members of the group. The so-called justifiable homicide of black people by police is ample evidence of how well this point applies. Hardly a week goes by in the major cities of our country where we don't read about some justifiable homicide where a black youth was shot in the back by a bullet from a white policeman's gun. Right now, they say they may indict the prosecutor in the city of Chicago because of what happened last year in the murder of the two leaders of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, who were killed by a fusillade of almost 100 bullets from the guns of people who said they were protecting themselves. And at best, if there was one bullet fired from the Panthers, that was all. Well, it seems now that a grand jury is about to indict, and still the American public refuses to believe the facts of life right before their eyes. And then number two in this Convention on Genocide, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group. Aside from the proven cases of physical brutality in many forms by police, there is the large-scale psychological brutalizing of blacks that occurs in our nation's schools. Any black person who has attended our nation's schools can tell you about the psychological brutalizing that they endure simply because they are black. That's what I have tried to emphasize for you as I've talked about the experiences of being black. I think that's the importance of having a Black Week, in order that in some way we may be able to empathize with each other. If you are really appealing to try to find out what it is like and what is it that I must do something about. And it's the empathy that can grow out of the kind of communication that we're attempting to have today. Number three of that from the United Nations is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In every rural district, in all cities of any size with their slums, are honest witness to the applicability of this article. I don't know how much you know about lead poisoning, but the number of young black children who have died from lead poisoning year after year remains an unrecorded statistic. All I can tell you is that the number is large in any major city. It seems to me that efforts to revolutionize education ought to be concerned with a total rehumanizing of our society so that we would be concerned about these things. And it seems to me that efforts to change education, if we are sincere in this, would be very concerned with recognizing the existence of racism and doing something to eliminate it. And I recognize that the road to needed solutions is not easy. A great deal remains to be done. It's going to take an awful lot of courage to do it. And I could go on discussing issues which ought to concern all of us. I could tell you about lots of things that are going on today. I could talk about the FBI spying in much more detail than you read about in the newspapers. And I could talk about the various forms of repression that one can observe if one is privy to such in most of the major cities of our country. But I think at this point I want to deal more directly with what it is we must do. I think that first I've been saying to you that it's only natural that students turn against an educational system that is designed to turn them against themselves and is designed to turn so many people against each other. Students cannot support such a system as I see it. Equally important, it seems to me that there is a breed of student emerging today who is determined to do something about an educational system that supports values which are demeaning for so many minority people in the country. These values which make people strive to become something which they can never become and should never want to become. I think that this is what I was talking about when I talked about the tendency to make black Americans aspire to the frustrating hope of becoming white Americans. But black America is not altogether alone in this. All minority group students in the United States are being educated in an environment which is hostile to their development as members of their own community. And they are being trained to participate in a society in which they do not belong, and are being taught to become alienated from those to whom they should owe primary allegiance, their brothers and their sisters in their own community. And you see, this is why in the past, so very often, black people, when they achieved the goal that they had aspired to for so long, rather than becoming assets in the community, abandon the community and has as their greatest hope the desire to become a part of another community and lose their identity. We say the kind of black person that we're trying to develop today is the kind of black person who recognizes that there is no way under the sun that he can ever be free as long as he has brothers and sisters anywhere in this country who do not enjoy that same condition. We are talking about that. I'm saying that the present condition must be altered so that an educational system will derive which contributes to and reflects the vitality of the experience of everyone in the country, in the history of this country. I think I'm suggesting to you that there is a need for change in the educational processes and the educational content of our institutions, not only for black people, but for all people. An educational system must develop in any demands, which is not only relevant and responsive to the needs of all people and to the threats against the survival of many, but one which supports the survival of minority group people in the broadest cultural terms. Such a system must promote the self-determined growth of the black community. Moreover, the system must liberate the minds and the souls of black people and help them learn how to mobilize their resources for the development of relevant values and humanizing institutions. It could be that the greatest beneficiary of a substantially revised educational system, rather than being the black students, would be the young white students who become alienated because of the many contradictions to which they have been exposed. In effect, the entire white community would profit because it would learn to cope with the insidious consequences of racism through an education that highlights the way that racism permeates every aspect of American life. They might then come to understand why so many people in America are discontented and impatient. Now, what kind of education am I talking about? What form should the educational curricula take? What should we do as our departure from the Greeks and the Romans? Seems to me that there's a great deal to guide us. Certainly it's significant to thoughts about changes in education and demands for more meaningful curricula for all people, that thought be given to the critical phases of the Black Revolution that began in the 1950s. The tactics of such revolutionary educators as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King ought to be studied very, very carefully. Eldridge Cleaver, Huey Newton, are other figures of controversy whose experiences can shed some light on the questions of relevance and effectiveness that are being raised about American education. You see, all of these men held in common and stated in their different ways the recognition that racism is at the base of the major problems confronting education and, in fact, all of America. It's very significant to me that white America has viewed Malcolm X as being anti-white, Martin Luther King as being nonviolent, and because he was nonviolent, they want to have a holiday after him. Eldridge Cleaver as being an unchangeable rapist. All such conclusions are at worst erroneous and at best misleading. They only emphasize the peculiar ability of this nation to assign categorical labels to black men. Moreover, these conclusions give sharp indication of the superficiality of prevailing understandings on the part of most white people, including those in educational administration, about racism and its consequences. The superficiality of outlook prevailing after completing a college experience is probably one of the most profound factors indicating the need for extensive changes in collegiate curricula, changes involving the impact of white racist attitudes on educational, social, political, and other practices. All college graduates, black and white, ought to be aware that Malcolm X, a non-racist, was proclaiming that one's right to be human is non-negotiable. You just don't talk about it. He was also asserting the inalienable right of the human spirit to exist as the free and exalted exemplification of God's will, with no man having the right to take any other man's life under any conditions anywhere except in self-defense. And these same people need to know also that Martin Luther King was involved in a most violent struggle to protect his right to be nonviolent and to reveal violence as an inherent part of American life. He too was dedicated to the proposition that all men must be made free, and they must be made free by any means necessary. And finally, any enlightened American should understand that Eldridge Cleaver, the convicted rapist, was pointing out through his writings that a racist system inevitably produces rapists. And as Dick Gregory has commented so often, one of the prime goals of a humane society must be to deal with those factors which create the need for people to rape each other.